Hi, I'm Kelly Beck, and these are my problems for the final turn-in. So this first one involves someone that their head is wet and they're outside. So it's going to be heat and mass transfer because you have the heat from like the sun, and then you also have the evaporating water. So here are the knowns, and I asked to find the total heat transfer for the wet head and for a dry head. So my assumptions are, so the head is a sphere. T surrounding is going to be the ambient temperature. It is forced convection and radiation only. So, and then constant properties. So at like each temperature, of course. And here are the properties I found there. And some equations. You got to find T average. And that's where I used the temperature for that for the properties. And you got to solve for your diffusion coefficient, which is this equation here. And then for the wet head, these are all the important equations that we have to use to solve. And that's where like the heat or the mass transfer comes in. And partial pressure, densities, you got to solve for those. And then here's your mass flow rate. And then ultimately you can use the mass flow rate to solve for Q for the wet head. Then here for dry head, you have radiation equation, Nusselt number, solving for some constants, and then finally you're solving for your convection heat transfer, and then total. And that's how you found the dry and the wet head. And it's the wet head involves more of the heat or mass transfer, and then the dry head involves more of just normal heat transfer. So my second problem is a big one, but it combines a ton of different learning outcomes. You have a cross-flow heat exchanger, and which will get the modeling for unit operations for the heat transfer part. And then it adds a tube where the cool air is entering from, which brings in internal force convection. And then I also zoomed out of the little land speeder and added in a resistance network to kind of solve a problem very similar to a double pane window. So I've given a bunch of knowns for part A, and I asked to find the air exiting the heat exchanger. So assume it's a cross-flow heat exchanger, obviously, provided constants do not change. And then here are some properties that I also provided so people didn't have to look them up. And then here are the important equations in relation to the heat exchanger, such as Q and then Q max. And here is efficiency. And then ultimately, this is what I got for the air exiting. For part B, which was the forced internal convection, here are the knowns. I asked to find H, LH, and LT, and assume constant T surface, and that the temperature difference isn't that large. Some properties, and here's the T bulk equation, Reynolds number, and I found that it was fully developed turbulent flow. So from there, here are the equations you need to use to solve for what I asked for. For part C, here the resistance networks, assume to use a resistance network and that radiation is negligible. So here's my little diagram of the resistance network and the two main equations that you got to use to find the total heat transfer from inside the little car to outside, and all of my R equations. And from there, it was relatively easy to solve. So my third problem combines mass diffusion transient, and then the mass transfer with a membrane as well, and most of it was solved using Cartesian coordinates. So Part A is where you have the transient mass transfer, because I asked everyone to find the time it'll take for the nitrogen to diffuse out to a certain concentration. So here are the knowns. Find T. I assumed 1D, a Cartesian and transient, and then the initial concentration outside was just, 0. So here are the main equations that you have to use. So that one I just highlighted was very important. And from there on, you just kind of plug and chug, solve for the error functions. I had to interpolate, and then you just plug everything in, and it's easy to solve for T from there. For part B, I said to treat it like a membrane. And so here's some knowns, and assume treat like a membrane and 1D. And defined the mass flow rate. So you need the partial pressure equation right here, this equation, and then ultimately once you got that, you just multiply it by the molecular weight to get the mass flow rate. So my fourth problem involved a cube of meat heating up, and sorry, this one was a transient heat with different spatial variations, so it was 3D. And so you have your knowns here, and I said to assume that the ambient temperature is the temperature of the dragon breath, which, since it's a baby, it's not fire, so it's just heating up everything on each side. So there's no heat transfer between the meat and the ground. You gotta assume that. And that it's two intersections of infinite plane walls. So here are some properties, and here are the main equations that you gotta use. So solving for the two different LCs for like each side. You have to solve for two different Biot numbers, and using each of the different lengths. So the one of like the height, and then the base, tau. And then from there, you just multiply those two equations and set them equal to this temperature difference. And then here's some more math and equations for that. And ultimately from there, it's just a lot of algebra, and you solve for T. And that was my transient 3D problem.